My name is Yusuf Munayyer. I'm a non-resident fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and the host of the center's podcast, 5 Questions. It's a pleasure to be with you to moderate this morning's discussion. As we are often confronted with scenes of home demolitions, forced transfer in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, and horrific scenes of violence in the Gaza Strip as well, it's often possible to think that the process of dispossession is limited to those territories. But in recent weeks, we had yet another reminder that the reality of dispossession is far broader than that, as Palestinian Bedouin communities in the Naqab protested and were brutally repressed by Israeli police as they were calling out against the moves to push them off of their land. I have with me today a distinguished group of academics and practitioners who will discuss the volatile situation in the Naqab in the context of Israel's larger ongoing policy of displacement and dispossession against Palestinians. We'll begin with 10 minutes of remarks from each of our panelists, followed by a question and answer session with the audience. A reminder to our audience, you don't need to wait until the question and answer session to submit your questions. You may use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit your questions at any time, or you can email your questions to events@arabcenterdc.org. Again, that's events@arabcenterdc.org. I'm going to briefly introduce today's panelists in the order in which they will speak before turning it over to them. Sami Abu Shehadeh is a Palestinian historian, leader of the Balad or Tajamu party, and a member of the Israeli Knesset for the Joint List. Riya Al'Sanah is a Palestinian researcher and activist from Lakiya village in the Naqab. Rawia Aburabia is assistant professor of law at Sapir Academic College School of Law. And Mansour Nasasra is an author and lecturer in Middle East politics and international relations at Ben Gurion University of the Negev. And last but not least, Huda Abu Obaid, a community organizer, advocacy coordinator at Negev Coexistence Forum for Civil Equality. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being with us today. It is a real pleasure and honor to be able to talk about this important subject with so many voices who are close to it and deeply, deeply knowledgeable about it. So I welcome you, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. I will now turn it over to Sami Abu Shehadeh, who will start us off with a look at the political context and aspect of the situation in the Naqab, the significance of the Naqab area, the Palestinian community and identity, and the role of political parties and organizing, and the role of Knesset members in particular. So Sami, please go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Yusuf, and thanks a lot for the Arab Center for having this important webinar. So thanks a lot for your kind invitation to be able to speak to this honorable audience about what's happening nowadays in the Naqab area with the Arab Palestinian Bedouin community living in this part of the state. But before getting into what's happening now and what is exactly the role of our parties in this all the things, I would like to give some historical background to put things in historical context so people can understand more what are we talking about. And it's very important to know that what's happening now in the Naqab is not something new. This is a continuous policies happening since the Nakba of 1948. Before the Nakba, before the war of 1948 in Palestine, the population of the Arab Bedouin population in this part of Palestine was something like 100,000 people. During the war, because of a process of ethnic cleansing that happened in the Naqab, unfortunately, very little know about the Nakba of the Naqab. Something like 10% of the population continued living in the Naqab after 1948 as a result of the ethnic cleansing that happened throughout the 1948 war. And only 11,000 people were left in the Naqab. Because the Zionist project and the state of Israel dealt with the Arab Palestinian Bedouin community from the beginning as enemies, after the war, they gathered all these 11,000 people and concentrated them in one area of the Naqab, which is called the Siyaj, the fence area, very small part of the Naqab land. So from the beginning, we should know that Israel was planning in order to conquer, in order to continue the conquest of the Naqab since 1948, and in order to continue the process of dispossession, because they were dealing with the Arab Palestinian Bedouin community from the beginning as enemies and not like citizens. The process of dispossession continued, not just during the war, but also after the war. Israel called in the 1950s a war that a lot of people don't know much about. It called it the borders law. So all the Arab Palestinian communities that were close to border areas in the south or in the east were also transferred into another area. This continued the pressure on the Arab Bedouin community in the Naqab. Now, when we are saying all the time Al-Naqab, the Negev desert, we are talking about something like more than half of the size of the Palestinian state, the Palestinian land. We all use the term Naqab, unfortunately, because of ignorance, because we don't know much about this desert area. So we call all of it Al-Naqab, Al-Naqab. We are talking about 13 million dunams. This is nearly little bit more than 50% of all of historical Palestine. This is a lot, okay? So we are talking about a very big piece of land. Of course, in Israel-Palestinian measures, not in American measures. Now, in this part of Palestine, we are talking now, today we have a third of the population out of 770,000 people, nearly 270,000 are Arab Bedouins. So this is a little bit more than a third of the population living there. And we are going to talk a lot about land issues. It's very important for me to make it clear to everyone that the Arab Palestinian population in the Naqab are sitting on something less, only 3% of the land. The state of Israel is chasing this Bedouin population while we are having less than 3% of the land, and the Arab Palestinian population consists of more than a third of the population of the people who are living in the Naqab area. So the state is still dealing with the Arab Palestinian community there in land issues like enemies and not like citizens. And all the time the plan is to make as much as big Arab group living and developing on as less as they can land. While we have the opposite process happening, that they are trying to bring, they are calling it developing the Naqab, while by the discourse of development, this is exactly like this old colonial discourse of development of the 18th and 19th century, which usually means the destruction of the local indigenous community and bringing people from outside the area. And they call it also processes of Jewidization. And they want to bring very small numbers of Jews and to spread them on very big pieces of land. So we have two processes happening in the same time in the Naqab. They are trying to bring as much as they can Arab Bedouin community on as less as they can land. And in the same time, they are doing processes of Jewidizing the Naqab by bringing big small number of Jewish groups on big pieces of land. Now, the main political player nowadays in the Naqab are settlers NGOs, mainly led by Regavim, that was also established and led by the party which is now leading the government, Naftali Bennett party, which is mainly supported by settlers. At that time, the Regavim people were built by the Minister of Agriculture at that time, who came from the extreme right, Uri Ariel, and they are using the same discourse as you mentioned at the beginning of your talk about Sheikh Jarrah, West Bank, Gaza, what's happening. What is really happening in the Israeli politics in the last few years, in the Naqab, but also in other areas, that the settlers have controlled all the important decision-making processes in the Israeli government, and they are leading with their racist, right, very extreme right-wing discourse, the political discourse of the state of Israel. This is why we are hearing now very hard words describing the Arab Bedouin community in the Naqab as invaders, as people who are trying to steal the land from the Israeli state, or they are doing illegal things in order to take more land, while what's happening on the ground is that these settlers are stealing the land. And they are continuing the planning to conquer that started already from the Nakba and continuing now also in the Naqab. A very important thing is that what's happening lately after the last elections in Israel, which is affecting everything. Because in Israel, the opposition is controlled by the right, and the coalition is also controlled by the right. Now, the competition is happening between the opposition and the coalition. Of course, I'm taking out of the opposition the joint list. This is third way of thinking what we are proposing. I will finish with this thing. But the biggest elements of the opposition, the Likud party with Shas and the Haredim, and the important components of the coalition, the Prime Minister's party, Lieberman's party, all the others' party. The competition now is who is more right, and this is bringing us in the Israeli political discourse, who is more right-wing means who hates more Arabs, who is ready to do more racist behavior towards the Arab Palestinians, who is more extreme towards anything which could be called Arab or Palestinian. This is making the government trying to satisfy the extreme fascist groups in Israel by attacking more the Arab Palestinians in general, but also in the Naqab. In the Naqab, it's happening more because Israel has worked on land confiscation from Palestinian hands straight after 1948 or straight after the Nakba, and we really don't have any more land in the areas of the Galilee or the Triangle area or in the mixed cities. The only area which we still have some land, while it's very, very small proportions, but still this is the only area, is the Naqab. This is why the attack on our brothers in the Naqab lately has become much stronger. In the last demonstrations we had against the one of the attacks on the area of Sawa area in the Al-Atrash tribe, we had a legitimate demonstration that was agreed, by the way, and licensed by the police. After a few minutes of starting the demonstration, because there were thousands, mainly young, but a lot of other people from the Naqab and from outside the Naqab, against the racist Israeli policies. After a few minutes, the demonstration was attacked by a huge amount of different security forces from Israel. We are talking about citizens doing demonstrations against state policies. But what we had on the field was unbelievable attack by the different armed forces, tear gas bombs, this bombs that makes a lot of noise, rubber bullets. Tens of the demonstrators were hurt. People went to the hospital. Then after we went from the main street, inside the desert, the police continued attacking the demonstrators and chasing them inside the desert. And after all this thing, of course, like they do it all the time, they continued blaming the victims. They continued blaming us for doing demonstrations. Nobody was asked any questions about shooting demonstrators or attacking demonstrators with tear gas bombs and all this violent attack. Nobody was held responsible for, because from the Israeli point of view, it's totally okay to attack demonstrators if they are not Jewish. So there were, this kind of behavior proves that the Israeli state still deals with the Palestinian citizens of Israel as enemies and not like citizens. I will stop here in order not to take the time of the others, and if there is anything else later on, I can talk during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that excellent context, Sami. Next, we will have Riya Al'Sanah, who will provide an overview and assessment of the situation on the ground, the current state of activism and international advocacy and solidarity, as well as the international media reporting. Riya, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that, Yusuf. It's a pleasure to be here. I don't promise that I'm going to do all of that in 10 minutes, but I'm going to do what I can. But I just wanted, before I start, I wanted to say something, maybe a correction on Sami referred to the Naqab as a desert, but actually it's not. That's part of the kind of the proliferation idea of the Naqab. It's kind of it's a Zionist movement trope in a way. The Naqab is it had the northern part of the Naqab is an agrarian area. There used to be export of wheat to the British Empire before the colonization of Palestine in 1948 from that area. So it's important for us to kind of remember that and to know that the land that is currently being fought over, kind of the minor struggle around the Sa'wi and that land, it's also agricultural land. So people are not just struggling for kind of their residential areas, but actually land is a livelihood. And I think it's important to remember that and acknowledge that and factor that into our conversation about what's happening in the Naqab, that it's an attack on livelihoods as well as kind of residential areas when we're talking about the unrecognized villages. But I will kind of leave the more details to the other panelists. And I wanted to use the time that I have to talk a little bit about what I think and I feel and kind of witness as the shifting political terrain in Palestine over the last year and a half or two or so. And I want to focus on three main things that I think have shifted or evolved. And then I want to end up with the challenges, with some challenges, because we always have challenges, otherwise we wouldn't be here. So the shifting terrain. First, I think there has been a massive shift on the level of representation. It is undeniable that there has been a shift in the kind of Palestinian representation on the international stage, in the sense of who speaks in the name of Palestine and who represents Palestine and who represents the struggle. And whereas previously kind of representation and our kind of outward looking messaging would be delivered and narrated by men who are also from the political establishment, and oftentimes would be kind of removed from the political processes that are developing on the ground or the impulse of the street itself. But I think that we have witnessed a change, and the opening of kind of new mediums of communication have enabled different voices to come to the fore. And these new representatives of Palestine internationally are speaking with a different tone. It is one of much more defiance. It is one that is much more eloquent in a way in its assertion to our right to justice and liberation, without kind of continuously capitulating or trying to navigate internationally sketched guidelines for what is do's and don'ts and what is acceptable and what isn't and what is just and what isn't. And we saw this shift. This shift is kind of ongoing, but we saw kind of a moment in the May 2021 mass uprising that engulfed the whole of historic Palestine, where you saw younger people on the forefront of the struggle, but they're also at the forefront of putting forward the narrative and a discourse of what is actually taking place in Palestine. And we saw kind of the courageous acts of the Al-Kurd siblings in the terms of kind of also how they engaged with the international media. And I think it has been escalating since then. And we see that in the Naqab today. It is young people that are taken to social media, rigorously engaging in a process of trying to explain both the events that are unfolding on the ground at that particular moment, but also contextualizing them. Talking about what's happening in their community, bringing kind of people into the local in a way, speaking both in Arabic and in English to the international community. And in that process of putting forward that discourse, there's a lot of agency and there's a lot of pride. And there's also a lot of pride in the act of resistance itself. So a lot of the videos that are going around showing bravery, showing strength, it is not kind of trying to hide from the act of resistance, but actually putting the act of resistance as an enabler and as a mobilizer and as a galvanizer for international solidarity and for international support and for local solidarity and local support as well. And the second shift, I think, that is connected to the first is a shift on the level of the political discourse. Whereas post the defeat of Oslo in 1994, the political discourse has been fraught and shaped by Palestinian fragmentation, be it geographical fragmentation, but also political fragmentation, of narrowing down and localizing the different experiences of dispossession that Palestinians experience. That is obviously a colonial tactic of divide and rule, but also our political establishment, the Palestinian political establishment and representative have also worked and played a role in entrenching this, right? So Palestinians in Israel as being Palestinian citizens, in the West Bank, it's the West Bank, Gaza is Gaza, and everybody's struggling in their own kind of, in their kind of own milieu. And the Naqab in and of itself is a massive victim of this kind of strategy of fragmentation. The Naqab as a region was historically and continues to be marginalized from the Palestinian national political movement as a whole, but also within politics within Palestine 48 as well. Despite the region being subjected to kind of the most extreme levels of colonial violence, and we see the struggle, kind of the colonial process is still very much unfolding in the Naqab, and where the struggle over the issue that is the heart of the Palestinian question, the land, is very much kind of alive and kicking, and it's kind of very much reminiscent of 48 and the Nakba and those times. So despite all of this, the Naqab has been continuously marginalized. But there's a shift here, and there's something else that is developing and changing as well. Across Palestine, there is a sense of that from below, there is a move against this tide of fragmentation that has been instilled in the Palestinian political movement. The discourse of not sidelining the particularities of the locals. So of course, the Naqab has its particularities and has its own way. There is a specificity to how settler colonialism manifests itself in the region. Rather than sidelining those particularities or entrenching those particularities, it is taking those particularities and situating them within a broader Palestinian story. So what is happening in the Si'we is not just unique and relevant to the people of the Si'we and the family of Al-Atrash, but it's actually the story of the Naqab as a whole. And the story of the Naqab as a whole is the story of Palestine as a whole. And I think that is something that is has been developing slowly on the ground, and we saw it kind of really explode in May. And we're still, the flame of May is still, luckily, the flame of May is still with us on the level of kind of the development of the political discourse. And I think maybe just also the attack on the Naqab, or the extreme kind of racist and vilification of the Naqab's Palestinians that has been massively increasing over the last few months, has to also be situated not just in kind of settlers now sitting in government, but actually has to be situated in the processes that happened in May, and the broad and deep participation of the Naqab's Palestinian population in that mass uprising that was actually a surprise for the Israeli political establishment, right? Because they thought that they have disconnected the Naqab from its Palestinian national identity, disconnected the Naqab from the whole of Palestine. And in May, actually, the Naqab showed we are Palestinians, we're part of the bigger story, and we will be part of the bigger story. And I think we have to kind of understand the attacks and the vilification also in that context, not just in the context of the change of Israeli political landscape. I don't know if do I have a little 1 second to talk about something else? Yes,
Sure,
I do.
go ahead.
Yeah. And the third shift, I think, is on the level of the integration of socioeconomic issues within the broader conversation. And I think you see that we can elaborate a little bit more on that in the Q&A, but I think you see that in the involvement of women and how women have been integrated and involved in the struggle. That isn't new, let's put that kind of argument to bed. Bedouin women have always been at the forefront and involved in struggle, but there is something different that is changing because society is changing. The socioeconomic composition of society in itself is changing, and that inevitably has an impact on the shape of struggle. But I also think that feminist notions are also informing struggle. Not feminist notions in the sense of the narrow sense of feminist politics, of like they're just fighting against the oppression, women's oppression, etc. But the understanding that struggle also demands care and attentiveness to the whole of the community. And that you can't just be struggling, just kind of fighting. You also have to develop mechanisms of support and solidarity from below. And so seeing things like groups of people organizing to deliver mental health support to detainees and their families, that's a representation of feminist politics being integrated into the political movement. And I think that's very, very important. And now the challenges. First challenge, and I think the challenges go hand in hand. It's both the Israeli strategy of extreme violence, of overt and covert violence, and what does that do in terms of people's ability to sustain struggle, and our lack of structures that are actually able to defend people and give them the power to sustain struggle, like, for example, supporting detainees who now are, you go out on a collective process of resistance, but actually then you're locked in a very individual process of trying to defend yourself, in a very costly process that impacts you as an individual, but your whole family. So then the people that are paying the price are very kind of, they're paying very heavy price, and they're paying that price alone as well, because we don't have those social structures of support and solidarity. That's on the one side. But on the other side, Israel is also pursuing an aggressive policy of co-optation, right? So your extreme violence and extreme co-optation of the Palestinian economic elite or political elite or whatever you want to call it. But there's those two things happening at the same time, where you completely brutalize a community and you break its ability. You continuously strive to break its ability to resist. But at the other hand, you also aggressively trying to co-opt a milieu of Palestinians that then start operating in the interest of the state and against our interests. And those two things are playing at the same time. And I think for all of us who are involved on the ground or trying to think about how do we harness the kind of the power and the agency of the last year, 2 years, we have to confront those because a colonized community is not a homogeneous community. There's also internal struggle within the community itself, and we have to acknowledge those in order to think about how do we move forward. So.
Thank you very much for all of that, Riya. I now want to turn over to Rawia to discuss the legal dimension and the significance and legal status of the Naqab and the relevant frameworks of international and human rights law as well. Rawia, the floor is yours.
Good evening, and thank you for the Arab Center for this important event and for the participants as well. So the Palestinian Bedouin community of the Naqab have suffered severe discrimination and have borne its consequences since 48 Nakba. This situation in which one population has been clearly and violently discriminated against in comparison to the Jewish population is intolerable and unacceptable. At the hands of the State of Israel, the Bedouin have been subjected to discrimination in the allocation of land resources, in planning and housing, in the non-recognition of their villages, in the denial of essential services to their villages, and in the state's refusal to recognize their traditional land ownership mechanism. Today, about 100,000 Bedouin, half of the Naqab population, live in 7 urbanized Bedouin township established after the end of marital law. Another 100,000 Bedouin live in 45 villages and ex-urban settlements. 10 of these are currently in different processes of being recognized and included in regional planning, while the remaining 35 villages haven't yet been recognized and are not regulated by regional or municipal planning and zoning. Some of these villages were in existence before the establishment of the state, while others were created after 48 Nakba, following the eviction and transfer of the population. Master plans for the Northern Naqab, prepared in accordance with the planning and building law enacted in 1965, entirely ignored the existence of the Bedouin villages and the residents' land rights. In the master plan, Bedouin lands were designated as agricultural land or under other such headings as industrial, military, infrastructure, etc., all with the same result, that residential construction in this area was prohibited. As a result, the Bedouin villagers were placed in an impossible situation which has lasted to this day. They cannot legally obtain any building permits, and the home in which they were born and raised and in which they eventually expanded their families are considered illegal by the state. These homes are perpetually under the threat of demolition and of incurring fines. It should be obvious that any constructions without permits in the unrecognized villages is performed not out of the desire to break the law, but out of necessity, a necessity created by the state policy which refuses to recognize the Bedouin rights to their land. Their villages are not connected to the national water supply, electricity grid, or sewage system. Essential services such as education, healthcare, and welfare services are provided only partially and not inadequately. And the state refuses to recognize the traditional ownership of their land. In the mid-60s, with the end of marital law, Israel continued its policy of concentration and confinement of Bedouin living in the living space in the Naqab. This was accomplished through the establishment of 7 townships built specifically for the Bedouin population, but without any consultation with the Bedouin leadership or any without taking into account their agricultural way of life or their social structure, etc. And these villages as well, the recognized one, lack adequate urban and economic infrastructure, neglected by the government, and they are among the poorest communities in Israel. Town residents suffer from poverty, unemployment, crime, limited education, and poor health, both in relation to Jewish communities, if we compare. The denial of essential services to the residents of the unrecognized villages is one manifestation of state concentration and urbanizing policy, it represents both a means of punishment and a mechanism to pressure the villages into moving to one of the 7 townships. As was mentioned previously, the idea that Bedouins should be concentrated in a small area within the Siyaj remains at the heart of the government policy to this day. The goal of this policy is to solidify political control over the Bedouin and to minimize as much as possible the cost of the physical and social infrastructures in their place of settlement. While refusing to recognize the Bedouin villages, Israel continued to employ a discriminatory concentration policy toward the residents, cutting them off from their former rural way of life and depriving them of their land rights. At the same time, the state continued to establish new rural Jewish settlements in the Naqab. More than 100 Jewish settlements exist today in the Bir al-Sabah district, with an average population of only 300 residents. Additionally, there are dozens of isolated farms that have been built without permits though the government has at times decided to recognize their status retroactively and include them in regional planning. The situation of the unrecognized villages in the Naqab are reflective of the government policies over the years, policies which view the Bedouin as squatter even while they dwell on their historical lands, policies which refuses to recognize Bedouin villages and grant them regulatory planning status or municipal status, and policies which refuse to recognize Bedouin ownership over their lands. The Bedouin are residents of the Naqab who have lived there for generations and for many years have employed an organized traditional system of property acquisition. This mechanism is still in use to this day and is utilized by Bedouin to record transactions, regulate costs, and resolve conflict. The Israeli government uses a legal doctrine that called the Mawat, the dead land, which classifies Bedouin land held by Bedouin until 48 as land that so-called are not uncultivated, unassigned, or uninhabited. And this is a legal doctrine that target to deny Bedouin from their ancestral legal rights of their land. And the state chose to contest Bedouin ownership claims and compete with them while completely ignoring their traditional system of land acquisition recognized as well by Ottoman and British as well. The validity of their system of land acquisition, which operated for generation as an integral part of their culture and tradition, hasn't been recognized by the Israeli legal system. Even when they choose to have their day in court, the Bedouin come to the table at a distinct disadvantage, not because their cause is unjust or their claims are untrue, but because they face an entire legal system that doesn't recognize their way of life, their culture, and their traditional ownership mechanisms, and basically doesn't do any justice with the indigenous community of the Naqab. The state ongoing refusal to honor the historic land rights of the Bedouin and the refusal to recognize traditional Bedouin ownership mechanism represent a severe injury to the Bedouin, their property right, the right to adequate housing, and the right to preserve their way of life. And it runs counter to the norms of international human rights law, which through a number of international declarations and charters has signaled out for protection the rights of minorities in general and homeland minorities in particular. Israel is a signatory to many of these, which enshrines minorities' right to equality, to property, to adequate housing, and to the preservation of their cultural character. Indeed, the Naqab Bedouin fit the classic description of a homeland minority, a distinct population with unique religious and cultural characteristics, organized by traditional social structures, and rooted by their way of life to their land, who are subject to new rule by a modern state that threaten their culture and property. Because of their vulnerability, homeland minorities have been signaled out for special protection under international human rights law, and these protections have been enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People. And these norms, as formalized in the declaration, first Bedouin were recognized as indigenous community, but the declaration include the obligation not to forcibly remove indigenous people from their lands or their living areas, and not to resettle them without their free informed consent and without full and fair compensation. Additionally, indigenous people retain the right to own, control, and make use of their historical ancestral lands, the territories and the natural resources that they control through their traditional ownership, and they have the right to regain those lands and resources that were forcibly taken from them. The declaration established the states must grant recognition and legal protection to the land, territory, and natural resources belonging to or under the control of indigenous people. Beside this declaration, I will just mention another obligation of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination that adopted by the Human Rights Committee state that racial discrimination against indigenous people is prevalent in various regions of the world, and that because many indigenous people have lost their land and their natural resources, their culture and their historical identity are consequently in jeopardy. The various UN committees that examines countries' compliance with human rights obligation under international convention have repeatedly pointed out the rights violations suffered by the Naqab Bedouin at the hands of the Israeli government over the years. The Naqab Bedouin have featured in almost every report of the UN committee that monitor human rights abuses in Israel. I will conclude from the perspective of international human rights law. The treatment of the Bedouin represent a dark stain on the country that systematically violate Palestinians' human rights. The various UN declaration and charters establish international standard for the protection of human rights with special focus of homeland minorities and indigenous people, showing that Israel is obliged to uphold those standards both in principles and in practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of that, Rawia. Now we will turn to Mansour Nasasra for his presentation. Mansour, please go ahead.
Okay, so well, thank you again. Thanks for the organizers and also for the distinguished speakers. I would like to draw some comparative aspects with what's going on in the Naqab, in fact, in southern Palestine, and also in Sheikh Jarrah. This is what I think is the most contemporary and important part of what's going on at the moment. And I will link it to a few important aspects of geopolitics. So the conflict is about geopolitics, is about aspects of the erasure of the natives, and as well as the continued Israeli policies of controlling the Palestinian properties and land, and based on our recent research, obviously some important aspects from our research. But what I would like to say briefly is what's going on in Sheikh Jarrah and the Naqab has basically a lot of similarities in terms of the Israeli settler colonial policies. What we see here is the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah and the ongoing Judaization policies in East Jerusalem since 1993. It has speeded up since Oslo, as we all know. But in fact, what we see in Jerusalem and in the Naqab is all about the borders in the case of East Jerusalem, and I think as mentioned by Riya and Sami and Rawia, we're talking about very important and strategic zones and areas in the south, in southern Palestine historically, the Naqab and Be'er Saba region, which is basically 60% of historic Palestine territory, and this territory that is under kind of conflict with the local indigenous communities is located in east of Beersheba, and is quite significant in terms of cultivation and also to the link to the city of Beersheba. So there is something important here that historically this community obviously was under since 1948 under a military rule, and this is the area that we are talking about these days. The enclosed zone, basically, most of the people that live in this area, the local indigenous Palestinian Arab communities, are basically have lost most of their land historically. And as you know, the importance of the Naqab is basically the border, the international border with Sinai, with Egypt, with Aqaba, as well as the nearest Palestinian city, Hebron, as well as Gaza. So that's a geopolitical location of the Naqab and Be'er Saba is quite significant. And I think what we see these days with the Israeli policies is linked to the importance of this region. And historically, this is a cultivated and very wealthy region in terms of cultivation, and also in terms of production of wheat and barley, as Raya mentioned, even through the port of Gaza all the way to Europe and Scotland. So that's a very important political, economic aspect of the conflict. We can see Sawa area here, cultivated in patches. This is the area that mentioned by British archival records. Most of those villages that we see the conflict around these days are mostly cultivated land, very rich historically in terms of the wheat and the barley. And that's another important aspect of what we see in Sawa is basically, it doesn't, it has nothing only to deal with the villages themselves. It's the geopolitical location of this area between Beersheba and the international airport of Tel El-Malah, which is Nevatim airport. So that's something very much related to this picture, I would say, in Sheikh Jarrah. This is Sheikh Jarrah, which is the most important geopolitical space in occupied East Jerusalem. And you can see how the importance of the Israeli political organizations that are already have been centralized in the Sheikh Jarrah region, and that's the region that links basically Sheikh Jarrah to the French Hell and what's called Jabal al-Masharif in Arabic, and also this is the 1967 borders. I think what Israel is trying to do in this area is basically erasing the green line, okay, the green line that crossed the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, and that's basically erasing the whole idea of a Palestinian state in this, or a Palestinian capital in this territory. So this is a very important historic strategic neighborhood. It's called Sheikh Jarrah, as we all know, but it has also an important aspect of history that basically brings Islamic history, brings international kind of organizations that were historically housed in Sheikh Jarrah. You can imagine those demonstrations that erupted in Sheikh Jarrah are quite similar in different formats to what happened in the Naqab recently. Most of those kind of expulsions of those communities, the slogans that we have seen, against those expulsion activities, the peaceful demonstrations, and the role of women and youth are quite significant in both cases. And also, what the important Israeli policies is basically trying to push more of those Palestinian communities from this neighborhood, in fact, to leave to beyond the border, and also to slowly expel those communities, which is quite important since the Oslo Accords. But why Sheikh Jarrah? That's the most important questions I raised in my recent scholarship on Sheikh Jarrah. Is basically Sheikh Jarrah is the symbol of the Palestinian capital, is the symbol of Palestinian sovereignty, is the symbol of Palestinian national institutions. That's, for example, the Orient House that Israel has closed since 2002 is just one example to say how strategic and how important is this neighborhood. It basically housed the most important Palestinian institutions, the Palestinian symbols, as well as the international consulates, as well as Palestinian universities, Al-Quds University, Hind al-Husseini, and many other examples of important institutions, heritage, cultural institutions, as well as even we can see the international community exists there, which is basically the European Union and many other international consulates that existed there since the Jordanian rule of this space. So this is basically the borders of the Palestinian state. This is the geopolitical location of Sheikh Jarrah, which basically tells the story of international recognition of a Palestinian state. So the Israeli policies of expelling more and more Palestinian families from the Sheikh Jarrah basically tells the story of the Israeli even not recognizing the Oslo Accord itself, because the Oslo has signified clearly that Israel, that Jerusalem will be basically discussed in a later stage. But since Oslo, since 1993, Israel has pushed for further escalation of the conflict in East Jerusalem, as well as trying to speed up the process of changing the reality. So basically taking over those houses in Sheikh Jarrah, and even trying to expel more Palestinian families from the neighborhood is another important factor in the Israeli policies in order to in fact to finalize the status of East Jerusalem, and that's a significant component of the peace negotiations that we have seen since 1993. But there are many other examples of why house demolitions in Silwan, for example, or also in Sheikh Jarrah, the recent house of the Salahiyya family in this neighborhood, basically just tells the story that those Palestinian families that were originally expelled in 1948 from the villages of or the western part of Jerusalem, even from Ein Karim, and as well as Lidda and Ramle and Yafa and Haifa. Those are communities that were expelled in 1948. The recent case of the Salahiyya family basically just tells the story of what Rawia mentioned in terms of the international law. This is an local indigenous communities that existed there since 1948, and all the international community recognized this is an occupied territory, that Israel has no function in this area, and demolishing this house even without obtaining a court decision says clearly how Israel challenged the international law system, the Geneva Convention, and also in related to occupied territories, as well as what has been going in the Naqab, which is also something that those are Israeli citizens. However, they are not protected under the international law, and neither in East Jerusalem or in the Naqab, despite all the regulations. So I think the whole package of the Israeli policies in East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, is basically to deal with the Judaization of the city, the ongoing settler colonial policies since 1993 have speeded up, and we can see this evident in all avenues in the old city of Jerusalem, and that's a clear statement that there's no Palestinian capital city that will be recognized in this area. And obviously the whole demonstrations that erupted in May 2021 is about the struggle over the sovereignty of this city, the sovereignty over the old city, the sovereignty over Damascus Gate, and the sovereignty over Sheikh Jarrah, which basically challenged the whole perception of the international community, as well as the recognition of this as an occupied land. And I think that the most important, what we see since May uprisings is the symbols in this city. The symbols of the Palestinian sovereignty is Damascus Gate in one way, or on other ways, it's also linked to the whole idea of who is the sovereign power in this region. In Sheikh Jarrah, especially, that's the most important part of Sheikh Jarrah is located in the borders of 1967, is a geopolitical location. It's an important location that tells the story of how strategic is the old city of Jerusalem. Basically, if you can walk 5 minutes from Sheikh Jarrah to the old city or the Damascus Gate, and that's just tells the story how strategic this location of the neighborhood, as well as the importance of this neighborhood historically, and the way Israel is still pushing for further expulsion of those communities. In fact, from the Sheikh Jarrah community, the last example is the Salahiyya family that were expelled against all the international laws and regulations in order to build a school there on the land that was owned by those communities, just tells the story. Also, as I mentioned earlier, in the Naqab, which basically tells a real story of taking those lands for settler projects in order basically to control those communities, in order to erase the Green Line in East Jerusalem, and in the Naqab is basically to control the most strategic region east of Beersheba, which basically are important aspects in linking those communities of Sawa to the city of Beersheba, which is the metropolitan and the most important economic center and political center historically for those communities. I think just one last sentence is basically the struggle here is about in the case of Jerusalem is about sovereignty, is about the green the Green Line, is about 1967 borders, is about recognizing the Palestinian capital city in East Jerusalem, and on the other hand, the same policies of erasure in the Naqab is basically linked to the Israeli policies of settler colonialism, as well as trying to take more land of the indigenous community land, and that's basically what has been left to them in both cases. So I'll stop here and we'll be happy to address some of the questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Mansour. Before I turn over to our final speaker, just a quick reminder that you can submit your questions for the panel through the Zoom Q&A feature or by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. We're already starting to get some questions in, so please do submit them. And now I want to turn to our final panelist, Huda Abu Obaid, who will round out this morning's presentations with a discussion on the importance of community organizing and mobilization, as well as the role of women and youth as part of the important voices from the Bedouin community. Huda, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for all that you organized this event. I'm Huda Abu Obaid. I live in Lakiya in the Naqab. I work in the Negev Coexistence Forum, and I was asked to talk about the local organizing in the Naqab, and I would like to begin actually with the first appeal of the Palestinian Bedouin population in the Naqab to the Israeli Supreme Court in 52 by Sheikh Ibrahim Al-Sanah that he used in 52 to go to the High Court to ask the State of Israel to bring the family back. The family actually was forced to leave from Lakiya to the Jordanian West Bank. So this was kind of first appeal that the Palestinian Bedouin community used to use. Then, and because of many reasons, actually, not only this appeal, that tribe or this family returned to the Naqab, to the Siyaj area that Sami talked about, and not to their village, and then all the Bedouin community forced to live in the Siyaj area under military role. And when you are under military role, you cannot really organize yourself or your community to do something when you feel that you're the state is putting an eye on you, on your community, on the people. So maybe until the end of the military role, until the end of the 60s, the Bedouin community didn't actually organize itself. And the first real organization established at the beginning of the 80s in Lakiya, my village. And then in the 90s, and actually after the Oslo agreements, when we as a whole Palestinians felt that okay, the Palestinian leadership is kind of given up on the Palestinian within the area of 48, was establishment of many civil society organizations, as Adala, as Musawa in Haifa, my organization, the Negev Coexistence Forum, the RCUV, which is the Regional Council of the Unrecognized Villages. And those organizations started to go to the court to ask for rights for the Palestinian community. Also in the Naqab, we talk about the right of access to water, the right for schools in the villages. So this was in the 90s, but still those organizations was kind of were working under the Israeli law and the Israeli, like, we cannot consider ourselves as Palestinians. We were asking of our rights as a community, not as Palestinian. It was kind of, they were kind of scared of being themselves, of talking as a part of the Palestinian people. So, and now if we're talking about the new kind of generation that Riya talks about, we're talking about people that didn't have the experience of living under military rule, and also their parents didn't really live under a military rule. So this is my personal way of view to what's going on with the young activists or young people who are protesting, that were not scared of the Israeli state or of the Israeli police. I remember in the protest 2 weeks ago, there was a moment that the police attacked the people. People went back, and then in one moment, most of the people starting saying to themselves, what are we doing? We came to protest. We didn't came to live in few minutes. So this is my way of view about the process of the civil society in the Naqab. And when we talk about the women role of it, I think, and from what I know, my personal story, my family story, women was all the time part of protesting, of taking part of when there is attack kind of about the Bedouin on the Bedouin community, so so women took part. Myself, I took part in the Praver campaign in 2013, and also then was talks about, okay, we see women in the front, but we saw women all the time in the front. This is my way of view, and if there is questions, I can answer. Thank you. I was kind of short.
Thank you very much for that, Huda. We are going to be moving to our question and answer session now. We do have a number of questions from the audience, and thank you all again for your presentations. I want to begin with a question for perhaps Riya, but others feel free to jump in here. You know, Sami had mentioned during his presentation the role of groups like Regevim. One of the groups that we didn't hear mentioned is the JNF, that is playing a pretty damaging role in what is taking place most recently in the Naqab. Can you speak to what it is that they are doing, what the intentions are behind this, and sort of how this ties into their activities throughout the land of Palestine, where they have pursued similar objectives?
I mean, I think Mansour or others are also qualified to talk about this, but but yeah, I mean, I guess it's first one should know that Jewish National Fund, the JNF, is not a new organization. It's an organization that predated the colonization of Palestine in 1948. It had an instrumental role in the colonization of Palestine, in arming the paramilitary movements with knowledge that facilitated the colonization of Palestine. It also it's intimately connected to Israeli state policies in the sense of planting trees. It's kind of, you know, portraying itself as a green organization for the benefit of the environment, but in a colonial context, everything has to be understood in that colonial context as well. So planting trees to erase memory and history of Palestinian presence of Palestinian communities in particular areas, and also as a way of controlling and taking hold over land. So the planting trees in a Si'aweh is not just kind of a question of, you know, it's not just a question of planting trees, it's planting trees while uprooting people. This is kind of a slogan that people have been saying on the ground, like you're planting trees but uprooting people. And the project, maybe others can also speak. I think Huda knows a lot about this project as well, that it's not just about the Si'aweh, it's way more, and it fits, and afforestation in and of itself is part of much larger, broader set of projects that are described kind of as developmental or national priority projects in the region.
Thank you for that, Riya. I want to move now to a question for Rawia that comes to us from our audience, from Diana Greenwald. She writes, from the perspective of international law, the initial ICC investigation in Palestine seems focused on war crimes and primarily in the OPT. Is there potential to pursue an investigation about the crime of apartheid in the Naqab? And with Israel not consenting to ICC jurisdiction, are there any avenues open via international law for accountability?
Yes, thank you for the question, and sorry if my internet is not that stable, as so sometimes I'm freezing. But speaking about an international law as a paradigm of dealing with human rights violation in OPT and in Israel as well, we have to remember that we have to follow jurisdiction, and and I'm not sure that ICC is the best venue of treating human rights violation of citizens of Israel. And there are other venues that could be useful. Since Israel is signed on several human rights convention, and the various UN committees basically examines countries' compliance with human rights obligations. And actually, here is the role of civil society in providing shadow reports that will show whether these international norms are implemented or not. And through this committees and that are supposed to monitor the ways of compliance, we could raise awareness toward these issues. So just several examples for this, for instance, the prohibition, the right of equality is one of the most fundamental human rights. The prohibition against discriminations appear in the ICCPR and Israeli signatory to it, or the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discriminations with a special prominence on comment 23 regarding the rights of homeland minorities, or the declarations on indigenous rights people, although it's declaration, so it has different obligatory status. It's part of international human rights customary norms, but still it's another venue, and so on and so forth. But I don't think that ICC is the particular thing, and specifically also apartheid, it's also recognized specifically by international human rights mechanism, and you have to, and it's not through this venue, but there are other venues to proceed. I myself was, when I was practicing human rights law, I was part of the group that basically did the international advocacy for recognizing the Bedouin as indigenous community. And I remember that when I met with back then Special Rapporteur James Anaya, he wanted to come and visit and see the villages and unrecognized villages of the Negev, and he was denied. And this is Special Rapporteur of UN. So we have to see how we as a community, whether academics, civil societies, politicians, expose and raise awareness for these grave violations under international human rights.
Thank you, Rawia. Sami, I want to ask you, continuing on this thread on apartheid. You know, last year, of course, B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, came out with an important report recognizing apartheid. Shortly thereafter, of course, Human Rights Watch came out with a landmark report doing the same. Those who would defend the Israeli government against this charge often point to people like yourself, members of the Knesset who are Arab, and say, how is it possible that Israel is practicing apartheid when we have Arab members in the Knesset? As you look at the through lines of dominance, dispossession, demographic engineering, as we've discussed from Sheikh Jarrah and into the Naqab, how do you respond to such claims?
Well, this is one of our biggest challenges, to be honest, is the gap between the image of Israel and the reality. The image of Israel is still mainly in the Western world dealt with as a democracy, or maybe a democracy that have some problems that should be fixed, but in general, it's a welcome kind of regime which is dealt with as the only democracy in the Middle East. While in reality, this is one of the most racist political regimes and societies that I have so far seen all over the world. And this gap, maybe this is one of our mistakes as Palestinians, that we did not work enough on bringing awareness to this gap. This is why I think that such an event or other events are very important to let the people know the truth. I think that of apartheid, by the way, in the Israeli context is a wishful thinking, because in apartheid regime, you don't need this demographic engineering. You are satisfied with the fact that a certain group, one of the ethnic groups, is ruling and controlling everything. But Israel wants to have it as a Jewish democracy, which is an oxymoron in itself. This concept of Jewish democracy, while you have a huge number of the population who are not Jewish, part of them are totally and don't have citizenship. They are not allowed to vote, like the Palestinians in the West Bank or Jerusalem or Gaza. And others are discriminated in all fields of life. Those who are defending Israel, I usually tell them, come to see. Come to see what is Israel. Come to see the gaps and discrimination in all fields of life. Anything you check, Yusuf, anything, any numbers you need to check in order to do comparison between Arabs and Jews tells you the true story about Israel. If you talk about the number of ministers, Arab Palestinian ministers in the Israeli government, if you talk about the representation of the Arab Palestinians in any important decision-making process, in any planning process, if you know, what is the most enlightened considered thing in Israel, in the West, by Haaretz newspaper, for example? This is a newspaper that has been living for something like a century. Do you know how many Arab editors Haaretz had? 0. Similar numbers you check if you check the presidents in the Israeli universities or any important figure in the Israeli economy, or if you check all the sports players, important sports players, everything that you check in numbers shows the gaps and the discrimination that the Palestinians are suffering from in all fields of life. And we are talking about the Naqab, for example. We have less than 3% of the land of the Naqab, while we represent 30% of the population, and the set is chasing us on this 3%. If you check any standards of living between Arab area and a Jewish area neighboring it, like Omer and Tal al-Sabah, for example. In Israel, there's a way to check the status of living, the level of living. It's called the socio-economic ladder. Tal al-Sabah has the number, and the ladder goes from 1 to 10. 1 is the lowest, 10 is the highest. Tal al-Sabah is 1. Omer, their neighbor that came much later after Tal al-Sabah, is 10. This is how life looks like. And the last thing I would like to tell you about is also go and check what happens in what is called mixed cities. Israel, the Zionist project, Yusuf, built a project which is built on racial separation. Unfortunately, we are all used to it, so nobody speaks about it regarding Israel. But 90% of the Israeli citizens, we live on racial separation, Arabs alone and Jews alone. 10% are living in the mixed cities, which were controlled since the Nakba of 1948 by the Jews. So they have also total control of everything in Lid, Ramle, Haifa, Akka, Yafa. Come to see the gaps between the Arabs and Jews living in these areas. In Lod, we have unrecognized villages for the Arabs inside the central city. Thousands of people are out of the master plan. And in 2022, Yusuf, we are talking about your city. People in Lod, in some of the neighborhoods, don't have normal water supplies, don't have normal electricity supplies. So anyone who really wants to know the truth, the best way to do it is to come to do a tour or to do any comparison between Arab Palestinians and Jewish citizens in Israel. And it works all the time in the favor of in the favor of the Jews. So the main explanation for this is racism.
Thank you for that very detailed response, Sami. One of the questions that comes to us in the from the audience, Mansour, perhaps I'll direct this to you, is sorry, how long does it take for Israel to provide these smaller settler communities in the Negev, assuming he's speaking of the Jewish population, with power and water? And can you give us a sense, of course, of how the Palestinian Arab population is treated in this regard?
Well, I think apart from what Sami and Riya and Rawia already mentioned, I think there is a situation here where there are around 36 unrecognized villages. Imagine in this cold winter, it's freezing, which is no services, no water supplies, no electricity, and how people can survive from 1948 until today, 2022, without services like electricity and water supplies, in a state that basically categorizes itself as one of the most kind of well-developed states. What are the consequences of those attitudes of being a democratic and a Jewish state, but marginalizing those communities from services for quite a long time? And I think it's also linked to the idea of the this region that has played a significant role in the Zionist movement colonization project. You know, even the GNF as an example. We have a not far from Al-Naqab, there's a forest called the Ambassadors Forest. Okay, and it's sponsored by the European Union. Yes, the European Union that also supports the people in Sheikh Jarrah and also in East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, and provide services and education to the Palestinian communities in the West Bank. Those are international community, which is significant. However, sometimes they're playing the role that they don't know what's going on here. As Sami mentioned, they should come for a study tour, and we would be very happy to run that tour and to see what's going on in Sheikh Jarrah with the Salihiyya family and Al-Kurd family and the Salaimi family and those families that were pushed in 1948 from Al-Baqa and Talibiyya, and also from Lidda and Ramle. You know, the services available for those Jewish communities also in occupied East Jerusalem, but not to the local communities of Sheikh Jarrah. Those are the indigenous native communities. The same is also in the Naqab. You know, no services provision since 1948, and then this right-wing government is trying to play the game of the political or the Israeli political kind of game on the territory of the people themselves. So I think the whole Israeli kind of politics is going these days on the Naqab, on the land of Sa'wa, which is basically you know, one in favor of providing services and recognition, or maybe, but the other is not. So they're playing the game of keeping the marginalization of this community forever. You know, I don't think there is any significant plan to recognize those villages. This is kind of a political game to preserve everything like as it is and stay there for quite a long time. While on the other hand, you can see easily in this 12 million dunams of territory, which is the southern part of Palestine historically, that extended from Beersheba to Eilat today, and Aqaba and the Dead Sea, and to Sinai region, that you can see easily Jewish private farms blooming the desert. Yes, easily. They have electricity, water supplies, and you know, you can get services and infrastructure easily. On the other hand, you can cross by Wadi Na'am village, which is around 15,000 people live there. The Israeli electricity company just run on top of their heads, and then they don't have services. So that's what can we call that in any international legacies, any international laws? You know, everybody that can hear us now, they know exactly what do we mean. That's the whole story of settler colonialism, the distinction between those communities on the basis of those are Palestinians, those are not, is a clear policy here. Apart from that, you know, controlling the indigenous local communities economy. You know, most of the people were kicked out from the northern part of the Naqab and the western part of the Naqab. And Raya mentioned those are the most wealthy, fertile land that used to be basically exporting wheat and barley to Britain, to Great Britain, Scotland. Yes, it comes from here, from this desert. It's not a desert. It's one of the most wealthy areas in historic Palestine, in Israel today, and that's a significant component of the economy. Became a significant component of the settler colonial policies. Keep those are marginalized, are poor, keep them poor, they struggle every day. On the other hand, most of those Jewish settlers and settlements have basically controlled those territories. They cultivated, they're wealthy enough, and then those people on just across the border or across the street are still struggling to survive on a daily basis. So those are different layers. And obviously, it's also in East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem. So I think in East Jerusalem, you can see the most marginalized communities in the whole city of Jerusalem is the eastern part in terms of infrastructure, in terms of services. Only 10% of the municipality of Jerusalem goes to East Jerusalem, which means a lot. Basically, okay, well, you can just cross from Sheikh Jarrah to Rahavia, and you can see two different words. And that's all the way across the mixed cities that Sami mentioned them: Lidda, Ramle, Yafa, and Haifa, and Wadi Nisnas, and Al-Halisa. And those examples, just to tell you, those are divided cities. They are not mixed cities anymore. And that tells the whole story of where are the Jews and where are the Arabs located. And it's not only in the Naqab, not only in Sheikh Jarrah and East Jerusalem, not only in the mixed cities, but all the way through.
Thank you so much for that, Mansour, and thank you to all of our panelists today for your contributions. We've come to the end of our session, and I'm sorry if we did not get a chance to get to any of the questions in the chat at this point. But on behalf of the Arab Center and our audience, thank you so much for your very important insights today on this very timely topic. Please do continue to follow the center's work and to sign up for our newsletter at arabcenterdc.org, where you'll also be able to find a link to the video of this event. Thank you again.